Okay, today's lecture will be entitled The American Gothic, a Psychogenesis, Neglected Houses and Unquiet Heirs. We're mainly going to be focusing on the haunted house as it appears in Gothic literature in America. This is kind of segueing from last week in which we focused more on the natural landscape of North America in these texts. Today we're going to be focusing on domesticity, the domicile, the haunted house, and all of its kind of implications for the principal protagonist. The haunted house in American Gothic feels supernatural, but is grounded in local history and the psychology of the principal protagonists. Haunted houses, they represent the ghosts of the past. And by ghost, I mean something not yet fulfilled, something not yet realized, or some kind of old injustice that persists through generations. And that house, the haunting of that house, is symbolic or a manifestation of that injustice, kind of carried over through successive generations. And that occurs in many of the texts we're going to be looking at today. There is a kind of creepy materialism that comes into play in a lot of these texts. And in that sense, it's similar to Frankenstein, how there's nothing more creepy than the raw viscera of humanity, and how if you are a strict materialist and you kind of chalk up human agency and life itself to mere physical processes and sinews and pressures and physics, that then if there's nothing, then the distinction or the boundary between what is alive and what is dead becomes quite tenuous. And I think Frankenstein plays with that, but we also see some of that coming into play in Lovecraft and in kind of the ideological underpinnings or the approach of Dr. Montague in The Haunting of Hill House. The haunted house as a symbol kind of stands for the shortcomings of materialist science, the inability for science to render satisfactory answers to the hauntings that go on in human life. Walls speak, they tell, they testify. You can be walled up alive. Wells contain, preserve. In other words, there's a correspondence between the architectural reality of the house and the psychological or historical reality of a place, a family, or a person. And there's also this abiding fixation on inheritance that I want to talk about this last item first in more detail, because I just want to point out a few texts, some of which were on the reading list and one of which was not, but I think it's still worth mentioning. Part of that fixation on inheritance, of course, has to do with whose house it is, who has inherited the house, who has inherited the property. And usually caught up in that question is an injustice, or at least some kind of moral question, or something that's slightly morally ambiguous, that makes the inheritance of the house not exactly devoid of consequences or troubles that persist. What do the principal protagonists inherit from the past? This could be a more wide-ranging question. The principal protagonists in each of these texts have an inheritance from the past, of which that house is symbolic, but that's just kind of the most primary, or the primary symbol of that inheritance. The question of inheritance is more wide-ranging. The inheritance could be a genetic inheritance, a hereditary inheritance, It could be an inheritance of guilt, or a perceived inheritance of guilt. It could be an inheritance of money, or and so these inheritances can be physical inheritance of property, but they could also be cultural inheritances, or historical inheritances, or psychological or moral inheritances. Or is there a lack of inheritance? In fact, if there is a sense in which you are disconnected from your past, if you do not inherit from your past, this can be a yet more unsettling ghost. These questions all circulate within these texts. The first one I want to just pinpoint or land on is one of the older texts in our reading list, and that is The House of the Seven Gables by Hawthorne. And all these questions of inheritance permeate the text. The question of whose house it belongs to, and what the principal and protagonists inherit from the past. In fact, not just The House of the Seven Gables, but many of Hawthorne's texts tend to dwell on this central question. You know, he is a descendant of the Puritans that settled New England. And so he sees as part of his cultural inheritance, and perhaps his psychological and moral inheritance, the Salem witch trials. They kind of loom large in his subconscious or his conscious mind as a moral or psychological inheritance. And so many of his writings are almost attempts to comment on or work through or kind of bear the burden of that past. So you have works like Young Goodman Brown, which, you know, he wrote in the mid-19th century, but most of his, or many of his writings at least allude to or actually take place in the 17th century during this early puritanical settlement era. And so you have Young Goodman Brown about some, you know, a satanic revelry in the wilderness. And you have, of course, The Scarlet Letter, which talks about moral questions in that time period in the 17th century, the earlier time period. And then you have The House of the Seven Gables, which, of course, has one foot in the 19th century and one in the 17th century. And let me just give you a brief sample of The House of the Seven Gables to show you a way in which the whole story is centered around this question of the inheritance of the past, morally, legally, etc. You know, every generation a new inheritor would emerge in the town of the Pynchon family, and sometimes these inheritors would be a little bit passive, but every once in a while you'd get a representative of this Pynchon family inheriting the house who was more bold and more willful, like the old original Pynchon who first managed to build the property. Traditionary gossips of the town whispered among themselves, "Here is the old Pynchon come again," when this new person arrived. Now the Seven Gables will be new shingled. Okay, so someone's going to come and fix up the property and restore it to its former glory, kind of like restoring the family to its former glory. From father to son, they clung to the ancestral house with singular tenacity of home attachment. For various reasons, however, and from impressions often too vaguely founded to be put on paper, the writer cherishes the belief that many, if not most, of the successive proprietors of this estate were troubled with doubts as to their moral right to hold it. Of their legal tenure, there could be no question. But old Matthew Mall, it is to be feared, trode downward from his own age to a far later one, planting a heavy footstep all the way on the conscience of a Pynchon. If so, we are left to dispose of the awful query, whether each inheritor of the property, conscious of wrong and failing to rectify it, did not commit anew the great guilt of his ancestor and incur all its original responsibilities. And supposing such to be the case, would it not be a far truer mode of expression to say of the Pynchon family that they inherited a great misfortune than the reverse? So they didn't inherit a fortune, but a great misfortune, because their inheritance was what came with the inheritance of the house was the inheritance of a curse that this original Matthew Mall laid upon the house, because the original Pynchon ancestor uh, acquired the house through perhaps dubious means, where Matthew Mall was accused of witchcraft and executed. And then here comes Pynchon and took his property after leading the charge of witchcraft against this original proprietor of the land, Matthew Mall. Colonel Pynchon had joined in the general cry to purge the land from witchcraft, nor did it fail to be whispered that there was an invidious acrimony in the zeal with which he had sought the commendation of Matthew Mall. It was well known that the victim had recognized the bitterness of personal enmity, and that he declared himself hunted to death for his spoil. At the moment of execution, with the halter about his neck, and while Colonel Pynchon sat on horseback, grimly gazing at the scene, Mall had addressed him from the scaffold and uttered a prophecy, of which history as well as fireside tradition has preserved the very words. God, said the dying man, pointing his finger with a ghastly look at the undismayed countenance of his enemy, God will give him blood to drink. After the reputed wizard's death, his humble homestead had fallen an easy spoil to Colonel Pynchon's grasp. When it was understood, however, that the colonel intended to erect a family mansion, spacious, ponderous, framed of oak and timber, and calculated to endure for many generations of his posterity, over the spot first covered by the log-built hut of Matthew Mall. So that's why the end of the story, the end of the novel House of the Seven Gables, it's very significant that some of the principal protagonists, when the principal protagonists abandon the old house finally and start a new life far away from that original property out in the rural areas, they kind of free themselves from this burden. They free themselves from this inheritance. Okay, now William Faulkner's Absalom was not on our reading list, but I do want to point to it because it's probably one of the most significant examples of Southern Gothic literature, or Southern Gothic American literature, and the parallels that run between the Hawthorne and this particular book are many, and I don't think it's an accident. I mean, who knows? But I suspect that William Faulkner knew quite well that he was writing in this tradition of the haunted house, the foundations of which were laid by Hawthorne. And it asks these same questions. Whose house is it? What does the principal protagonist inherit from the past? And the principal protagonist in the case of Absalom is this kid, Quentin Compson. And the whole book is a kind of this kid, Quentin, it's his kind of excavating layer upon layer of the past, trying to kind of figure out what his cultural inheritance is. And every layer that he delves down into reveals more horrors or more ghosts, really. Quentin is described as being kind of this multiple personality. There's two Quentins. There's one Quentin preparing for Harvard in the South, the deep South, dead since 1865 and peopled with garrulous, outraged, baffled ghosts having to listen to one of the ghosts which had refused to lie still longer than most had, telling him about old ghost times. And the Quentin Compson who was still too young to deserve yet to be a ghost, but nevertheless having to be one for all that since he was born and bred in the deep South. The inheritance that Quentin Compson is dealing with is depicted as being centrally located in or manifested by this mansion which in the story is called Sutpen's 100, which is 100 square miles of property on which this enormous kind of southern mansion was constructed. The origin of this property is all very dubious, and the origin of his fortune is also dubious. This Thomas Sutpen character, he's not from really, he's not from wealth, but he became obsessed with making for himself a legacy. And so he wanted an inheritance, and he kind of did everything he could and drove himself crazy to create one of these storied families that kind of accrue wealth through generations. But he gets his start, by suppressing a slave rebellion in the French West Indies. And then he buys a bunch of African slaves, and they're referred to as wild. And Thomas Sutpen himself is referred to as wild. And I think he wins like the 100 square miles from Native American Indians in a card game. And then he uses his slaves to kind of take the land out of the swamp. And of course, there's this question of not only the inheritance of the property, but the kind of genetic his plans, and then everything kind of goes to hell, and the mansion burns down. And it's all this very Southern Gothic kind of tale of tragedy, multi-generational tragedy. And this is Quentin Compson's inheritance. And you don't get the whole tale kind of delivered to you on a silver platter. You have to work through it, and it gets darker and darker the deeper you go. And so this idea of like excavating almost layers and layers of the past is very prominent in this book. In the Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman also it deals with a lot of other questions, but there is a tie-in with this question of inheritance as well. For one, kind of a biographical note, Charlotte Perkins Gilman was born into a family of some means, but then her father abandoned the family, leaving her to be quite destitute growing up and raised by relatives and a single mom. So that question of like inheriting from the patriarchy, or this sustaining the family name or the family lineage, and the dubiousness and unreliability of that inheritance kind of comes into play in some of her writings. So in the Yellow Wallpaper, she talks about the property. Again, there were greenhouses, but they are broken now, so it's kind of derelict. There was some legal trouble, I believe, something about the heirs and co-heirs. Anyway, how the place has been empty for years. So again, this question of who's inheriting this property. That spoils my ghostliness, I'm afraid, but I don't care. There's something strange about the house. I can feel it. So there's an abiding presence and of abandonment, perhaps. We'll come back to the Yellow Wallpaper, but I just wanted to point out some of the questions of inheritance in The Haunting of Hill House. Now, this is interesting because there's like almost a framed story within a story where Shirley Jackson refers to Oscar Wilde's The Canterville Ghost. And that in itself, so this is a story within a story, or at least a reference to a story within a story. And in The Canterville Ghost, if you recall, if you read it, this question of inheritance comes into play as well when the American twins, who are the kids of the family who bought this old English, these American twins of this family who brought this old English manor house or mansion, they kind of turn on the ghost. Like they don't take the ghost seriously. It's almost like they don't take the idea of inheritance seriously. And so it kind of depicts an American tradition of rejecting the inheritance of the past, kind of scoffing at questions of tradition, which an old English manor house will have in abundance, but an American, kind of a hard-nosed American industrialist of the fin de siècle, of the turn of the century, of the 20th century, when Wilde is writing, that these people would be not impressed by the English ghost that tries to haunt them. Just a little segment from that story by Wilde. The old woman smiled and answered in the same low, mysterious tone. It is the blood of Lady Eleanor de Canterville, who was murdered on that very spot by her own husband, Sir Simon de Canterville, in 1575. Sir Simon survived her 9 years and disappeared suddenly under very mysterious circumstances. Ooh. His body has never been discovered, but his guilty spirit haunts the chase. The blood stain has been much admired by tourists and others. Cannot be removed. That is all nonsense, cried Washington Otis. Pinkerton's champion stain remover and Paragon detergent will clean it up in no time. So, who cares about all these like spectral hauntings from previous centuries and the whole idea of there being some kind of metaphysical or preternatural haunting from some distant past? There's this sense of loneliness and disconnectedness that is the inheritance of Hill House. So that when Eleanor hears the story of the origin of the house, it appeals to her, or it makes an appeal to her, or it establishes a connection with her, or she feels connected. It's so relatable to her. I think it becomes so relatable to her. Hugh Crane's young wife died minutes before she was first to set eyes on the house, when the carriage bringing her here overturned in the driveway, and the lady was brought lifeless, I believe is the phrase they use, into the home her husband had built for her. He was a sad and bitter man, Hugh Crane, left with 2 small daughters to bring up, but he did not leave Hill House. Children grew up here? Eleanor asked incredulously. The doctor smiled. The house is dry, as I said. There were no swamps to bring them fevers. The country air was thought to be beneficial to them, and the house itself was regarded as luxurious. I have no doubt that 2 small children could play here, lonely perhaps, but not unhappy. Okay, let's look briefly at the yellow wallpaper. The yellow wallpaper is basically an autobiographical account, unlike these other texts. And we know that because Mitchell in the story is happens to be Charlotte Perkins Gilman's actual doctor, who did prescribe bed rest for her. And so her story is an account of her kind of working through her prescription of bed rest. This particular figure, Silas Weir Mitchell, is a fairly well-known figure for those people who study like 19th century American medical history. He was a prominent physician. He made an illustrious and lucrative career out of treating nervous, hysterical, and insomniac women, mainly, many of whom had tried to make inroads into the so-called brain-working professions. And brain work is actually a term that's highly specific to the 19th century. And what it means is it's quite simply work that's not manual labor. So if you were a bricklayer, you were not a brain worker. But brain workers were lawyers, accountants, journalists, professional writers, mathematicians. These people worked with their brains and not with their hands. So there was writing in the 19th century that basically was saying that women should not go into the brain working professions because their nerves couldn't handle it. So in Mitchell's book, Wear and Tear, 1872, he warns his readers and prospective patients that American women in particular are the least qualified to undertake those weightier tasks which tax so heavily the nervous system of man. It is ironic then that one of the main reasons Mitchell is known to us today is through his immortalization in a canonical work of 19th century American fiction, and indeed the product of a woman's brain work. the principal protagonist in The Yellow Wallpaper is unable to really stop thinking, unable to sleep. She becomes not just imprisoned by the walls and the yellow wallpaper, but kind of imprisoned in the sense that she becomes a part of the prison, because her mind is almost indistinguishable from these tracery patterns on the walls that she's so keen on describing, like ad nauseum. The unnamed protagonist in The Yellow Wallpaper is an insomniac, confined to her bedroom by John, her physician husband, for a temporary nervous depression, a slight hysterical tendency. She lies awake at night, her hyperactive thoughts fixated on the patterns interlaced across her domestic prison's papered over walls. Thus, her mind, in attempting to trace this wallpaper tracery, becomes a kind of simulacrum of her surroundings and their complex, confused, superfluous, and interminable designs. I'm getting really fond of the room in spite of the wallpaper, perhaps because of the wallpaper, she says. It dwells in my mind so, she says. I lie here on this great immovable bed, and I determine for the 1000th time that I will follow that pointless pattern to some sort of conclusion. Insofar as there is this relationship between the wallpaper and her mind, her desire to find some sort of conclusion to the pattern of the former manifests a coterminous desire for a cessation of thinking, a desire for sleep. But she cannot seem to crack the code that will allow her this inner peace. What would likely get overlooked by a more pedestrian temperament is just wallpaper after all. For her starts kaleidoscoping into wonders. The pattern forms bloated curves and flourishes, a kind of debased Romanesque with delirium tremens that go wading up and down in isolated columns of fatuity and run off in great slanting waves of optic horror, like a lot of wallowing seaweeds in full chase. It is indicative of the exuberant flamboyance, the flights of fancy and irrationality to which hysterical Victorian women were thought to be susceptible, that she loses herself in these great mental arabesques. The protagonist is a diarist, and these ornate descriptions of the wallpaper form a significant portion of her diary entries. She is, as Jürgen Wolter has suggested, trapped between two expanses of paper, the wallpaper and her writing paper. And her reading of the wallpaper's lines and her writing about them become parallel acts of subversion, undermining her therapy. Furthermore, since we as readers only have access to her story through her increasingly unreliable written account, we thus, like her, become spectators to mere lines on paper, a tangle of irrational symbols. This wallpaper has a kind of sub-pattern, she says, in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, for you can only see it in certain lights and not clearly then. But in the places where it isn't faded and where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to sulk about behind that silly, conspicuous front design. So she almost sees herself lurking behind the patterns. I think that woman gets out in the daytime, and I'll tell you why. Privately, I've seen her. I can see her out of every one of my windows. It is the same woman, I know, for she is always creeping, and most women do not creep by daylight. I see her in that long, shaded lane, creeping up and down. I see her in those dark grape arbors, creeping all about the garden. I see her on that long road under the trees, creeping along. It's interesting to note that Eleanor in The Haunting of Hill House also is this kind of solitary figure, cut off from society. She's also seen creeping along the walls, much like the narrator in the yellow wallpaper. There's several interesting parallels in the book between the kind of hard-nosed materialism of Dr. Montague and Washington Otis from the Oscar Wilde story, who is dismissive of any metaphysical explanation. And John, the husband of the narrator in the yellow wallpaper, also is dismissive of metaphysical explanations for phenomena. Mrs. Montague, on the other hand, is, I mean, not only is she open to the prospect or the possibility that things could have metaphysical explanations, but she is so staunch in her advocacy of metaphysical explanations that she puts forth a new narrow-mindedness. So she says, "Come along, everyone." Silently, they followed her up the staircase. They're following Mrs. Montague, watching her little affectionate dabs at the stair rail and the carvings on the walls. "It is such a blessing," she said, "to know that the beings in this house are only waiting for an opportunity to tell their stories and free themselves from the burden of their sorrow." It's interesting that Mrs. Montague here says that she's eager for the spirits, the beings in the house are waiting for an opportunity to tell their stories and free themselves from the burden of their sorrow. And of course, one has to kind of assume that the author here is, in an underhanded way, suggesting that this is a way for Eleanor. The whole story that we're reading is a chance for Eleanor to tell her story and to come clean with the fact of her loneliness, and almost, as morbid as it sounds, like by virtue of her suicide, to free herself from the burden of her sorrow. That's a bit of a dark reading, but I couldn't help but make that connection. So you have this dynamic between Mrs. and Mr. or Dr. Montague. Meanwhile, the true story, I think, is this kinship between the architectural edifice of the Hill House and Eleanor, and how it's, she is representative of its isolation. She's representative of its loneliness. So there ends up being the symbiosis between the Hill House and Eleanor, and she wants to stay, and realizing she can't, she has to kill herself. And so on that happy note, we will bring this lecture to a close, and thank you very much for joining us today.